"Get out of our sight, Mom. This is our house now. Can't you see you're just in the way?" Those words didn't come from a stranger. They came from my son, Troy. The boy I carried for 9 months, raised on a factory salary and prayers, the child whose scraped knees I kissed and whose future I put ahead of my own for decades. I stood on the front porch, grocery bags hanging from my fingers, the plastic stretched thin with collard greens, a small chuck roast, and a box of banana pudding mix I'd bought out of habit because Troy always loved it, even if he pretended he didn't anymore. For a moment, my mind refused to move forward. It stayed stuck on the sound of his voice, sharp, final, embarrassingly loud in a quiet Marietta, Georgia neighborhood where people pretended not to hear family business. "My name is Gloria Washington. I am 65 years old, a black woman, a widow, and until that evening, I believed I still had a place in my son's life. I had just come back from the store. That was all, a normal, ordinary errand. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, I saw the trash cans at the end of the driveway, both lids flipped open, black bags overflowing. Something pale caught my eye. Fabric. I walked closer, my heart starting to race, and that's when I saw it clearly. My life. My church hats crushed under old cardboard, photo albums bent and half open, family faces staring up at the sky. The quilt my mother stitched by hand the year I got married stuffed into a trash bag like it had no history, no value, no soul. I stood there frozen, grocery bags digging into my palms, when the front door opened behind me. Troy stepped out first, tall and rigid, blocking the doorway like a guard. Brittany followed him, arms crossed, lips curled in something that looked too much like satisfaction. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely holding together. "Why are my things in the trash?" Troy didn't answer right away. He took a breath, like he'd been rehearsing. "We're fixing the paperwork," he said. "I'm getting the house put in my name." The words hit me harder than the shouting had. "What?" I whispered. "I'm standing the house over," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume could turn betrayal into fact. "It makes sense. Brittany and I are married. This is our future." My knees went weak. I grabbed the porch railing to steady myself. I don't understand," I said, my hands starting to tremble. "Why would you do that without talking to me?" Brittany laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly. It was a short, cold laugh, full of contempt. "Because Gloria," she said, tilting her head, "we don't live the same kind of life you do. You wouldn't understand. You don't belong in our world." I stared at her, stunned. "Our world," I repeated. She looked me up and down my sensible shoes, my faded cardigan, the grocery bag still hanging from my hands. "We're trying to move up," she said. "And honestly, you don't fit the image. You're not our level. The words sliced through me. I turned back to Troy, waiting, begging for him to stop this, to say she'd gone too far, to defend me. He didn't. "I just want peace," he said quietly. "Brittany and I want our own space. You're always around, always watching. We can't breathe." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I forced them back. "I only wanted to be close to my family," I said. "After your father died, you were all I had. I stayed because I wanted to help, because I wanted to be near you." Brittany rolled her eyes. "That's exactly the problem." The memories rushed in then, uninvited and cruel. Working double shifts after Troy's father got sick, selling my wedding jewelry to help with Troy's college books, signing loan papers so they could move into this house when the bank wouldn't approve them, cooking dinners, paying bills, staying quiet when Brittany complained about my TV volume, my food, my very presence. Family meant sacrifice to me. To them, it meant convenience. I slowly bent down and placed the grocery bags on the porch. My hands were shaking now, but my movements were deliberate. Careful, I wasn't going to collapse in front of them. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. Troy looked away. "You'll figure something out." Then he said it. We changed the locks. The door closed. The sound echoed through my chest, like something breaking for good. Across the street, I felt eyes on me. A curtain shifted. Someone pretended to check their phone. No one came over. No one asked if I was okay. I walked toward the trash cans, each step heavier than the last. I reached in and pulled out the quilt first, shaking dirt and leaves from my mother's careful stitches. Then the photo albums. My hands moved automatically, rescuing what I could, pieces of a life that had been discarded because it no longer fit someone else's plans. As I knelt there on the driveway, gathering my belongings from the garbage, I finally understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't about space. It wasn't about marriage. It wasn't even about money. It was about erasing me. They wanted the house without the history, the comfort without the cost, the future without the woman who made it possible. I stood up slowly, arms full of salvaged memories, the house behind me glowing warmly with lights that no longer welcomed me. They thought this was the end of my story. They were wrong. They had only shown me exactly who they were and reminded me of who I still was. If this story moved you, hit like and tell us where you're watching from. Someone near you might be watching too. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old cigarettes. Not the worst I've seen, but enough to remind me this wasn't home. I placed the few rescued items, my mother's quilt, a torn photo album, and the tattered envelope of old bank receipts on the second twin bed with care. Then I sat on the edge of the other bed and just stared. The clock on the wall ticked. I hadn't cried yet. I think my body didn't quite believe what had happened. Maybe it thought I'd wake up back in the house, the smell of fresh coffee in the kitchen, Troy stumbling in late from work, apologizing for the misunderstanding. But that wasn't coming. Instead, I looked down at my hands. They were shaking not from fear, but from rage and shame. I had been thrown out, erased, dismissed like a housekeeper whose contract had expired. Worse yet, by my own child. I opened the small refrigerator in the room and pulled out the banana pudding cup I had brought, the kind Troy liked as a boy. I had no appetite, but I peeled the foil lid back anyway. I needed something sweet, anything to break the bitterness clinging to my throat. A knock startled me. Just the wind. This old place creaked and groaned like an elderly neighbor with too many stories to tell. I wrapped myself in the quilt. It still smelled like the cedar chest I kept it in for decades, that chest now likely tossed aside or sitting broken on the curb. My eyes wandered to the water-stained ceiling, and slowly, the memories poured in. I remembered the winter Troy broke his arm, slipping on the icy porch. I sat up all night with him, feeding him soup, fluffing pillows, calling into work sick, so I wouldn't leave him alone. I remembered him crying on my lap at 17, heartbroken over his first real breakup. I held him and told him love would come back when he was ready. And I remembered the way Brittany first looked at me smiling, polite, but too polished, too quick to steer the conversation back to herself. I thought she was nervous. Maybe she was just calculating. The signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. The time they changed the family Netflix password without telling me. The new couch they bought and tossed my old recliner into the garage to make more room. The day Brittany complained that my cooking smelled too southern and asked if we could do takeout instead. Death by 1,000 small humiliations. I wrapped the quilt tighter around me and pressed my head into the pillow. Sleep came slowly and in fragments. I kept jerking awake, hearing Troy's voice again in my dreams. "Get out of our sight, Mom!" I woke with the first light of dawn bleeding through the cheap vinyl curtains. My back ached from the stiff mattress, and my mouth was dry. But in my chest, something new had settled. Resolve. I wouldn't go back there. Not to beg. Not to argue. Not even to explain. I had always believed in family. In second chances. In forgiveness. But forgiveness was not the same as allowing yourself to be used and discarded. I got dressed, brushed my hair back into a simple bun, and gathered the papers I had managed to save. The deed. I didn't have the whole file, but I had enough to remember one thing clearly. I was still the legal owner of that house. When Troy moved in years ago jobless, bitter from a failed startup, I had offered him a place to stay. Not a gift, not a transfer, just a home, until he found his feet. He found more than that. He found comfort, stability, and then entitlement. I sat down at the tiny desk and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, an old accident, but it worked well enough. I scrolled through my contacts, past the names of old church friends and coworkers, until I found the one I needed. Robert Chen, attorney. My fingers hesitated over the dial. It had been almost a decade since I'd spoken to him. He was the one who handled George's will, who filed our house deed after the refinance. I pressed call. It rang twice before I heard his voice. Steady, professional, but warm, like a man who still remembered the people behind the paperwork. Robert Chen speaking. I swallowed. Robert, "It's Gloria Washington. I don't know if you remember." "Mrs. Washington," he said immediately. "Of course I remember. How are you?" There was a long pause. I didn't know how to answer that. "I need to ask you something about the house." "Of course. What's going on?" I took a breath. "My son and his wife. They've thrown me out. They're trying to claim the house. I still have some of the original papers, but I need to know what rights I still have." He was silent for a beat. Then his tone changed sharper, more alert. "You're still listed as the sole owner, Gloria. There were no legal transfers, not from my office." Relief and grief surged together. "Then I still have control?" I asked quietly. "Yes," he said. "You have full rights." I closed my eyes. "Can we meet?" I asked. "Absolutely," he said. "Come by this afternoon. Bring what you have." "Thank you, Robert." As I ended the call, I felt my spine straighten. For the first time since Troy's voice shattered my world, I felt something firm under my feet again. This wasn't over. Not even close. Robert Chen's office was exactly as I remembered, quiet, efficient, and filled with books that smelled like memory and dust. A simple plaque bearing his name hung on the door of a second-floor office in a modest building in downtown Marietta, next to a dry cleaner and an old watch repair shop that hadn't changed their sign since the 70s. The receptionist, a young woman with warm eyes and too much energy for a Monday, greeted me like an old friend. "Mrs. Washington, Mr. Chen is expecting you." I adjusted my purse strap and nodded. The folder in my hand held what little I had left from that house, copies of property tax receipts, a few mailings in my name, and the original letter from the refinancing over a decade ago. It felt thin in my grasp, but I knew the weight of truth it carried. Robert rose from his desk as soon as I entered. He hadn't aged much, his hair was more silver than black now, but his eyes still had the same steadiness I remembered when George and I sat across from him years ago, nervously finalizing our estate planning. "Gloria," he said, walking around the desk. "It's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." I managed a small smile. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly." He motioned for me to sit, then lowered himself into the chair across from me, hands clasped, patient. "Tell me everything," he said. And I did. I told him about the groceries still sitting on the porch, the trash bins filled with my life, Brittany's laughter, and Troy's hollow shrug as he told me the locks were changed. Robert listened without interruption. Only when I mentioned Troy's plan to put the house in his name did his brow furrow. "He said he was fixing the paperwork," I said. "Like I was a clerical error." Robert shook his head. "That house was never transferred. The title is still solely in your name. Even if he lives there, that doesn't entitle him to ownership. You never signed anything relinquishing your rights." "I never even thought to," I said quietly. "It was always just mine, ours. I let him move in to help him get back on his feet. I never imagined he'd try to take it." Robert leaned forward. "You have every legal right to reclaim that house. We can file a formal notice of possession and serve them with a legal notice if you choose." I was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want a court battle. I want my dignity back." He nodded. "Then let's talk about what that looks like. You have options. You can remove them. You can sell it. You can retake possession quietly. Sell it." The word lodged in my chest like a sharp pin. That house held years of my life. George and I had chosen it together, raised Troy there, laughed, cried, prayed in those walls. But it wasn't mine anymore, not in spirit. That house had become a monument to betrayal. "I'll think about it," I said, standing. I just needed to know I wasn't crazy, that I still had something left. "You're not crazy," Robert said. "You're the owner." As I stepped out of his office and back into the Georgia sun, the air smelled different, brighter, almost. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't homeless. I was a woman who had been pushed too far, and now I was stepping back into the light. I walked a few blocks before calling a cab, not ready to return to the motel just yet. I didn't know where I was going, not exactly, until I found myself sitting in the back seat of the cab and murmuring the address. Troy's house. My house. I didn't go to make a scene. I wasn't there to knock on the door or demand an apology. I just needed to see it with new eyes. The cab pulled up a block away, and I asked the driver to wait. I stood on the corner, half shielded by a line of overgrown hedges, and watched. Music was playing from inside. The front door was wide open. Balloons were tied to the porch railings. Someone was grilling in the backyard. The smell of barbecue floated into the air, mingling with the high-pitched laugh of Brittany echoing through the neighborhood. A party. They were throwing a party. I saw people I recognized from church, from the grocery store, from the block, laughing, sipping drinks, clinking glasses on the porch I had scrubbed down every spring with a bucket and bleach. One woman held a drink in her hand and gestured toward the house with admiration. "Beautiful space," I heard her say. "So clean, so fresh. You can tell they've made it their own." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I turned away. I walked slowly back to the cab. I said nothing, but in my chest, something new had grown bigger than anger, colder than sadness. Clarity. This wasn't just eviction. This was erasure. They weren't grieving the absence of me, they were celebrating it. They didn't think I'd fight back. They didn't think I had anything left in me. They thought they'd won. And that's when the thought truly rooted itself in my mind. What if I didn't fight to stay? What if I let them keep their lie but sold the house right out from under them? Not in revenge, but in justice. In truth, in quiet, thunderous power. I didn't say a word on the ride back. But I opened the window and let the wind rush through, lifting the edges of my scarf and drying the tears I hadn't even realized were falling. I was going to reclaim my name, my home, my story, one signature at a time. Back in the motel room, I sat with the lights off, the early evening creeping in like fog through the thin curtains. The hum of the old mini-fridge and the occasional murmur of other guests down the hall were the only signs I wasn't alone in the world. The photo album lay open across my lap. Most of the pages were water-damaged, warped at the corners from the night they'd spent in the trash, but the faces remained. George's strong arms around me on our anniversary. Troy at 10, standing next to a science fair project. I stayed up all night helping him finish. Me, smiling too wide, always tired, always hopeful. I touched the edge of the picture, my fingers lingering on a past version of myself, one who still believed that love was enough to earn respect. The memory of Brittany's laugh echoed in my mind. "You don't belong in our world." That wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. She wanted me gone. And Troy, he let it happen. I could have sat in that motel room forever, swimming in grief and shame. But something deeper stirred. Not spite, not even anger. Direction. There was someone I hadn't thought of in years. Sandra Marks. She was one of my favorite students back in the day, before I retired from teaching middle school. Bright, driven, a little too talkative in class, but never unkind. I ran into her once at the grocery store about 2 years ago. She had just started her own real estate company, specializing in upscale properties across Atlanta. I still had her business card tucked into the front pocket of my old church planner, now creased and faded from time. I found it, dialed the number, and waited. "Marks Realty, this is Sandra." Her voice was confident, warm, still carrying that spark of sunshine I remembered. I hesitated. "Sandra, it's Gloria Washington. I'm not sure if you remember." "Miss Washington?" she gasped. "Of course I remember. My favorite teacher. Are you okay?" I closed my eyes for a second. It felt good to be remembered like that. I'm fine. I'm just looking into the possibility of selling a house. Quietly. And I didn't know who else to call. She paused for a moment, then her tone softened. "Of course. Do you want to meet somewhere and talk?" I nodded. "That would be nice." We met the next morning at a small cafe near the square. I arrived early and chose a booth in the corner, away from the window. I didn't want to risk seeing someone I knew, someone who might ask where I'd been or why I looked so tired. Sandra walked in 10 minutes later, dressed in a smart navy blazer, her hair in a sleek twist, exuding calm professionalism. But when she saw me, her face broke into a genuine smile, and she hugged me like family. "It's so good to see you," she said. "You look, well, tired, but strong." I smiled. "You've always had a way with words." She laughed and ordered coffee for both of us, then got straight to the point. "So tell me about the house. Why now?" I hesitated. I didn't want to unspool everything, not yet. There were some wounds still too raw to expose in daylight. "I just need to start over," I said. "I'm ready to close a chapter, and I want to do it on my terms." She nodded slowly, not pressing. "I get it. Sometimes peace is more valuable than property." I gave her the address and watched her eyebrows lift in recognition. That neighborhood's hot right now, she said. Inventory is low, and buyers are desperate for homes like yours. You could sell it in a week, maybe less, especially if we market it right. I swallowed. What would I need to do? Nothing, she said. Let me handle it. I'll run comps today, draft a private listing, and we'll go from there. No open houses, no signs in the yard. Discreet, just like you want. I reached across the table and touched her hand. Thank you, Sandra. I don't want it to be dramatic. I just need to move forward. Her eyes softened. You taught me how to move forward. Don't think I forgot who pushed me to apply to college when no one else believed I could go. Let me return the favor. We talked a little longer about her business, her 2 kids, the way life circles back in unexpected ways. As I left the cafe, a breeze lifted my scarf. I looked up at the sky, pale blue and cloudless. For the first time in days, my shoulders felt lighter. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was making decisions. That house was never going to be home again, but it could still serve one last purpose, a door to something new. Maybe this wasn't the ending I thought I deserved. Maybe it was better. It had been 3 days since the meeting with Sandra, and she'd already called twice with updates. Each time, her voice was filled with quiet confidence. There's interest, Gloria, she said this morning. Serious interest. Cash buyers. They want to move quickly. I told her that was fine, and it was. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I spent the morning walking the streets of my old neighborhood, not the main block where my house stood, but the surrounding area. I needed air, needed to put one foot in front of the other and feel the pavement underneath me. Something real, something that didn't lie. I passed familiar sights, the corner store where I used to buy milk and scratch-offs, the mailbox that had leaned slightly to the right for years, never quite fixed by the city, the bus stop where I once waited in the cold to take Troy to school after the car broke down. All of it seemed smaller now, like time had shrunk it without asking. As I turned the corner near the old oak tree, the one that dropped acorns like hail every fall I saw her, Mrs. Evelyn. She was sitting on her porch in her usual spot, wrapped in a pale green cardigan, a newspaper folded neatly on her lap. Her white hair was pulled back into a bun, and her eyes, sharp despite her age, lifted as I approached. Well, well, she said, raising an eyebrow. Gloria Washington. Thought the ground swallowed you up. I stopped, managed a smile. Still standing, just taking a walk. She squinted at me. That's not your usual walk. You pass by here when you're carrying groceries or headed to church. You look light today, like someone carrying less than usual. I'm just taking a break, I said carefully, stepping away for a bit. Mrs. Evelyn tapped her fingers against her mug. People talk, you know. Say you moved out. Say the boy and his wife took over. I felt something twist inside me. I'm not here to talk about them, I said gently but firmly. She didn't push, just nodded. All right, but if you need something, you know my door's always open. You helped me after my hip surgery, remember that? I remember, I said. You made me that peach cobbler when I sprained my ankle. We shared a small smile, but the silence between us wasn't entirely comfortable. I knew that look in her eyes, part pity, part understanding, all woman who's seen it before. You look tired, she finally said. I am. I didn't stay long. Just long enough to remind myself that some people still noticed, still remembered. As I walked away, her voice followed me like a feather on the wind. Don't let him take what's left of your joy, baby. I nodded, though I didn't turn around. That night, back in the motel room, I stood at the window and looked out into the parking lot. A young couple argued quietly near their car. A man in a faded cap smoked a cigarette under the flickering light. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried and a television blared a commercial for a personal injury lawyer. This wasn't living. This was floating, waiting, and for the first time in a long time I asked myself, where do I go from here? I'd spent my whole life circling around other people, my husband, my son, my students, my church. I cooked, cleaned, prayed, and paid bills. I was the one people leaned on, the one who always had it together. But no one had ever asked me what I wanted. And, truth be told, I had never asked myself either. I sat down at the small table in the corner of the room and pulled out a pad of paper from my purse, the one I used to keep grocery lists on. Instead of writing milk and eggs, I wrote one word at the top of the page. Underneath it, I wrote the question. If I could start over, what would I want? At first, the page stayed blank. Not because I didn't have answers, but because I didn't know where to begin. Would I want a small house of my own? Somewhere quiet, with a porch and a rocking chair? Would I go back to church more regularly? Maybe even volunteer again? Would I take a trip, just one, to someplace I'd never been? The idea thrilled and terrified me. I didn't need much. I never had. But I wanted peace. I wanted a place that didn't come with echoes of slammed doors or the sting of being called a burden. I wanted to be seen. Not as someone's mother, not as someone's mistake, but as myself. The next morning, Sandra called again. "We've got a written offer," she said. "It's full price, cash, no inspection required." I blinked. Already? They love the location, and I pitched the house as having a lot of family potential. That's what buyers want to hear. I wanted to laugh. Family potential. The irony. "Do I have to decide today?" I asked. "Not today," she said, "but soon. They're eager." I told her I'd think about it. Then I went for another walk. This time, not around my old block, but toward a neighborhood I'd always admired but never considered for myself. Quiet streets. Modest homes with manicured lawns. Elderly folks sitting out front, waving to passers-by. It smelled like jasmine and grass clippings. It looked like safety. There was a "For Rent" sign in front of a small white bungalow with a yellow door. I wrote down the number. Maybe I wasn't ready to sign papers just yet, but I was ready to imagine again. The next morning, I stared at the number I had jotted down in shaky handwriting, 404-782-1193. It was written on the back of a grocery receipt that still smelled faintly of oranges and hand sanitizer. The address belonged to the white bungalow with the yellow door I'd passed on my walk the day before. There had been something about it, a warmth, a simplicity, a feeling I couldn't explain. I didn't know what I expected when I called. Maybe a gruff voice, maybe a young couple who wouldn't rent to an older woman with no recent credit history. Instead, a calm voice answered on the third ring. "Hello, this is Marla." "Hi," I said, adjusting the phone against my ear. "I'm calling about the house on Willow Street, the one with the yellow door. I saw the For Rent sign out front." "Oh, yes. It's still available," she replied, her tone instantly brighter. "Are you looking for yourself?" There was no judgment in her voice, only curiosity. "I am," I said. "I'm looking for a fresh start." Something in the way I said it made her pause. "Well," she replied gently, "I think that house has a bit of magic in it. Maybe it's the yellow door. My mother always said yellow means hope." I smiled. "Then maybe it's exactly what I need." We agreed to meet that afternoon. She gave me the time and promised to have the key ready. I arrived early. The house was even more charming in daylight. Small, single-story, with flower beds along the walkway, overgrown but still colorful. There was a swing on the front porch, a real one. Not the fancy kind you buy from catalogs, but an old wooden swing with thick ropes that creaked a little when the wind blew. Marla pulled up in a blue Buick, waved at me as she got out, and introduced herself with a firm handshake. She looked to be in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, tall, with silver-streaked curls and kind eyes. She wore a sweatshirt that read "Retired Nurse, Full-Time Grandma," and carried herself like someone who'd seen everything and still chose kindness. "Come on in," she said, unlocking the door. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of lavender. The floors were hardwood, worn but clean. The living room had big windows that welcomed sunlight. The kitchen had white cabinets, a little chipped, but charming in a lived-in way. There were 2 bedrooms, one with blue curtains, the other empty. "I used to rent it to a teacher," Marla said. "She moved to Florida to take care of her mom." I walked through slowly, touching the countertop, running my hand over the back of a dining chair left behind. It wasn't grand, but it was safe. And I realized then, safety was something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Marla followed me into the living room. "It's $850 a month," she said, "includes water. And I don't require a credit check. I go by feel." I turned to her, surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "I trust my gut, and you seem like someone who's been through some things, but still has fight in her." "I like that." My throat tightened. I hadn't expected generosity. I hadn't expected to feel seen. "I don't have a lot of income right now," I said honestly. But I could pay the first month today. Marla studied me for a second. Then she smiled. That's all I need. If you ever need help, just ask. I live 2 houses down. I reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope with the money I had tucked away. Emergency funds, meant for just in case. This was the case. We signed a simple rental agreement at the kitchen table. Her handwriting was neat, her pen smooth. When it was done, she handed me a single brass key. "Welcome home," she said. That night, I stood on the front porch of my new space, the key heavy in my palm, and looked out across the quiet street. Porch lights flickered on. A dog barked 2 houses over. Somewhere, someone played a radio low jazz, maybe Miles Davis. I opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. No shouting. No Brittany. No locks changed. Just quiet. I curled up on the couch with my quilt and turned on the small lamp beside me. The photo album was still in my bag. I pulled it out, flipped to the page with the picture of George and me in front of our first apartment. We were young, broke, and completely in love. "I did it, George," I whispered. I finally chose something just for me. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself cry. Not from pain, but from relief. The house was quiet in the mornings. No footsteps above me. No television blaring from another room. Just the sound of birdsong and the occasional distant hum of a lawnmower. I had begun to fall in love with silence again. I spent the first few days cleaning every corner of the new house. Not out of duty, but out of ownership. This place, no matter how small or temporary, was mine. I scrubbed the baseboards, opened the windows, and let fresh air breathe through the rooms. It felt like I was sweeping the old ghosts out along with the dust. One morning, as I sat with a cup of chamomile tea on the porch, the phone rang. I recognized the number Sandra. "Gloria," she said quickly, her voice buzzing with energy. "We have a firm offer, full price, as I mentioned, but the buyers would like to meet you, in person." I sat up straighter. "Meet me?" "Yes. It's not required, of course, but they said they're very particular about the properties they buy. They want to ensure it's a clean transaction, their words. We can meet at my office, or I can arrange it at your lawyer's, if that makes you more comfortable." "Robert's office," I said without hesitation, "just in case anything needs legal eyes." Sandra paused. "You're very composed about all this." I smiled faintly. "That's because I've already said goodbye." We scheduled the meeting for the next day. I arrived early at Robert's office. The same chair, the same smell of paper and time. He greeted me with his usual calm and offered me water, which I accepted more out of politeness than thirst. "They'll be here any minute," he said. "I'll stay with you through the meeting." "I appreciate that," I said. The door opened at exactly 10 o'clock. A young couple stepped inside, both in their early 30s, polished, confident, dressed in the kind of business casual that screams new money. She wore a powder blue pantsuit and carried a leather-bound folder. He had a close-shaved beard and the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Long," Robert greeted. "This is Mrs. Gloria Washington, current owner of the property." They extended their hands, which I shook. Their names were Amelia and Darnell. As we all sat, I noticed the way Amelia's eyes lingered on me. "You look familiar," she said. I gave a polite smile. "I used to teach. Maybe you've seen me at a school event." But I knew that look. Recognition, but not respect. "Let's get started," Robert said, sliding a packet of documents toward them. They reviewed the paperwork quickly. Amelia spoke most of the time, asking about timelines, contingencies, and whether any liens existed. Darnell seemed distracted, checking his phone intermittently. Then, just as we were finishing, Amelia said, "It's a beautiful home. We know the area well. Friends of ours, Troy and Brittany Chambers, live nearby." The room fell still. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. Robert, sensing the tension, jumped in. "That's a coincidence. But I must remind everyone, this transaction is entirely separate. The seller has chosen to remain private beyond this meeting." Amelia smiled. "Of course, no offense meant." But there was offense. The kind that's tucked behind polite words and expensive folders. We completed the necessary forms. The money would be held in escrow for a few days. Robert would handle the transfer of title. It was done. I rose first, shook their hands again, and turned to leave. As I reached the hallway, Amelia's voice followed. You've kept the place in beautiful shape, Mrs. Washington. We'll take good care of it." I paused just long enough to offer a quiet, measured reply. "I hope you treat it better than some people do, the ones who built it." Then I walked out. Outside, the sky was overcast, but the air was warm. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders like rainwater off a roof. It was done. I had signed away the last legal tie to the life I used to know. Not in bitterness, not in fury, but in peace. The house was no longer mine, but neither were the burdens that came with it. Back at the new place, I unlocked the yellow door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me. There was no celebration, no champagne, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the slow exhale of a woman who had finally let go. That night, I cooked myself dinner for the first time in weeks. Baked chicken, steamed greens, a little cornbread from the mix I had tucked into my bag before leaving the motel. I lit a candle on the table and ate in silence, listening to an old Billie Holiday record spinning on a borrowed player. Afterward, I sat by the window and watched the wind stir the porch swing. I thought of Troy. I thought of Brittany. I thought of the party, the laughter, the way they had discarded me like a forgotten package. But I didn't feel sad. Not anymore. Just free. The envelope came in the mail 2 days later. It was plain, white, and unremarkable except for the return address, Robert Chen, attorney at law. I already knew what it contained, but I opened it slowly, as if the paper might bite. Inside were 2 documents. The first, a confirmation of transfer of ownership, my signature, the buyer's signatures, a finalized sale. The second, a certified check my portion of the profit, less Sandra's commission and closing costs, a substantial amount. Enough for a fresh start, maybe even more. I placed the check in the drawer next to my bed, folded the papers, and then sat still for a long time. It was done. Not the beginning of something new, not yet, but the end. The house was no longer mine. The place I scrubbed, prayed in, grieved in, raised Troy in it belonged to someone else now. And yet, I didn't feel grief. I felt space, room for something else to grow. I spent the afternoon sorting through my file box, an old banker's box I'd kept for decades, filled with bits of my life. Pay stubs, letters from former students, recipes scribbled on the back of church programs. Near the bottom, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was something I didn't recognize at first. A folded envelope, yellowing at the edges, with my name written across the front in George's handwriting. I froze. George had been gone almost 6 years. I remembered packing up his study after the funeral, tears in my eyes, placing keepsakes in boxes I couldn't bear to open again. I must have tucked this letter away and forgotten. With trembling hands, I opened it. The paper was thin, the ink a little smudged, but his handwriting, always neat, always careful, was still perfectly legible. My Gloria, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I wrote this one quiet night, just after your birthday. You were asleep in the chair, still wearing your apron. I couldn't help myself. I needed to write this down while I had the clarity to say it right. You've always been the heart of this house, of this family. You gave your everything without ever keeping score. I don't know how you do it, but I thank God every day that you do. If someday, God forbid, things turn cold between you and Troy, if he forgets the love that raised him, you must remember something. You are not a burden. You are not less because you are alone. You are still the strongest person I know. Don't let them take your dignity, Gloria. Not ever. Not even if it comes wearing the face of someone you love. Keep your head high. Choose peace. And when the time comes, yes, even sell the house if you must. Brick and wood are not our legacy. You are. With all my love, always, George. The letter slipped from my hands and landed in my lap. I didn't wipe the tears that fell. I let them come. He had known, maybe not exactly what would happen, but something. He had seen the strain in Troy's eyes, the entitlement in his tone. He had trusted me to remember who I was, even when others tried to rewrite me. I read the letter again, and again, until the words etched themselves into me like scripture. Brick and wood are not our legacy. You are. For the first time since leaving that house, I felt proud not of what I left behind, but of how I left it. I placed the letter gently back in the envelope, folded the handkerchief over it, and set it in the top drawer of my dresser. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden lines across the floorboards, I changed into my Sunday blouse, pressed my slacks, and tied a soft scarf around my neck. I wasn't going out for errands. I was going to visit George. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill just outside the city. The grass was freshly cut, and the air smelled of magnolia and earth. I brought fresh lilies, his favorite, said they reminded him of hope. His headstone was simple. Just his name, the dates, and the words we had chosen together. Faithful father, steadfast friend. I knelt beside it, brushing a leaf from the stone, then laid the flowers gently in front. I did what you asked, I said aloud, though the only witnesses were wind and sky. I didn't beg. I didn't scream. I let go, and I kept my dignity. The breeze stirred. I wish you could have seen it. The look on their faces when they realized I wasn't coming back. I laughed softly, then felt the lump in my throat rise again. I miss you, every day, but I think I'm learning to carry you with me, instead of chasing where you were. I sat beside the grave for a while longer, not talking, just being. It was quiet, and it was enough. Before I left, I placed my hand on the top of the stone and whispered, "Thank you for leaving me your strength." Then I turned, walked back to the car, and drove toward home, not the old house, but the one with the yellow door, the one I had chosen. It had been a week since I visited George's grave, and something inside me had shifted, not in a loud, dramatic way, but quietly, like the gentle creak of a door that had long been stuck and finally opened. I wasn't in mourning anymore. I was in motion. That Tuesday, I passed a bulletin board at the local library while returning a novel, and a bright yellow flyer caught my eye. Watercolor for beginners, ages 55 plus. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 a.m., Community Arts Room. No experience necessary. Come as you are. I stood there staring at it for a while. I couldn't remember the last time I did something just because I wanted to. I used to draw as a child, sketching dresses in the margins of my notebooks. But then came work. Bills, diapers, PTA meetings, casseroles, funerals. Art had no place in survival. But now I had a little space, a little quiet. So I took the flyer and showed up 2 days later. The community center was a low brick building tucked behind a park. Inside, it smelled of coffee and craft glue. The art room was bright, with wide windows and folding tables arranged in a horseshoe. There were only 6 of us, all older, all a little hesitant. The instructor was a woman named Nora, with purple glasses and a voice like a flute. She wore paint on her clothes like it belonged there, and introduced herself like we were already friends. "Art isn't about talent," she said. "It's about paying attention, looking twice, letting yourself be curious." We started with shapes, loose circles, wet-on-wet color washes. My first attempt looked like a toddler's lunch plate, but when I laughed at myself, the man across the table chuckled too. "Not bad," he said. "Looks better than my splat." His name was Frank. Tall, in his early 70s, with salt and pepper hair, and a voice that made everything sound like a story. We fell into easy conversation. He used to be a photographer, he told me, back when film was king, married for 42 years until his wife passed from a stroke. "I still forget she's not at home waiting for me," he said softly. I nodded. "Grief has a long tail." He smiled at that. "Yeah. And sometimes it curls around your feet when you're trying to move on." After class, he walked me to my car. "You coming back Thursday?" he asked. "I think I will." "Good," he said. "It's nice having someone here who doesn't pretend life's all daisies." That night, back at home, I unpacked my supplies. The starter kit they gave us wasn't fancy, just a set of student-grade paints, a few brushes, and thick paper. But when I laid everything out on the kitchen table, it felt like I was preparing for something sacred. I filled a mason jar with water, taped the corners of the paper down like Nora had shown us, and dipped the brush in a gentle blue. At first, I just played. No plan, no pressure. But then, my hand moved in memory, shaping something soft and familiar. A porch swing, a yellow door, a quilt on a line, flapping in the wind. I painted the pieces of my new life, the small things that held me. When I was done, I sat back and looked at it not with criticism, but with something like affection. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I pinned it to the wall above the table, next to a photo of George. "You'd laugh at this," I said aloud. Me, making art. But I felt him smile, somehow. The days grew lighter. I returned to class every week. Frank and I developed a rhythm. We didn't talk about the past much, but we shared pieces like puzzle corners that hinted at the full picture. He brought me coffee in a thermos one morning. Cinnamon, he said, because life should have a little kick. I painted a lemon tree in class and gave it to him. Because you're sour and sunny, I teased. He laughed, deep and warm. And you're a storm with a heart. We didn't talk about romance. Neither of us wanted that. What we shared was rarer. Recognition. One afternoon, after class, we sat on a bench outside and watched the wind ripple through the trees. You ever think about what your life might have been if you'd made one different choice? He asked. All the time, I said. But then I think, maybe I wasn't supposed to be happy young. Maybe I was just supposed to get here. To this part. He nodded. Yeah. Maybe joy's just late sometimes. When I got home that evening, I painted a small landscape of the park, our bench, 2 tiny figures in shadow. I tucked it into a drawer, not ready to give it away yet. This wasn't about starting over with someone else. It was about returning to myself. The phone rang in the late afternoon just as the sun was tilting toward golden hour, staining the sky with honey and rose. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table, brushes laid out, half thinking about the next painting I might try. Something abstract. Something hopeful. I didn't recognize the number at first. But when I saw it flash on the screen, a slow warmth spread through my chest. Hello? Gloria? It was Mrs. Evelyn. Her voice had that same steady rhythm, gentle, curious, as if she'd never once felt rushed by life. Yes? I said. It's Evelyn, from down the street. I smiled before I even responded. Hi, Mrs. Evelyn. How are you, dear? She asked. I paused, searching for the right words. I'm finding my way, I said finally. There was a soft exhale on the other end. I heard from some folks in the neighborhood that you moved. I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. I appreciate that, I said. I'm doing okay. I'm glad, she said. We're having a little gathering on Sunday afternoon, just a few neighbors and friends. I'd love for you to come if you're free. I blinked, taken aback. A gathering? Nothing fancy, she reassured me. Just tea on the porch, some pastries, some friendly chatter, no pressure. I looked out the window at the yellow door of my bungalow, imagining a scene filled with laughter and kindness rather than echoes of loss. I think I'd like that, I said. Wonderful. I'll send you the details. We hung up and I sat in silence for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of surprise at how easily her invitation warmed something inside me. Sunday came with a soft breeze and clear skies. I dressed in a simple blouse and comfortable slacks, feeling a flutter of nerves I hadn't felt since the watercolor class. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my scarf, and reminded myself that this was not a test. It was just company. Mrs. Evelyn's porch was adorned with flower pots, fresh blooms spilling over in color. The steps were worn and welcoming, as if they had seen years of laughter and shared stories. A pastel tablecloth covered the card table, where Mrs. Evelyn had laid out an assortment of teas, cucumber sandwiches, and pastries that smelled like sunshine and good intentions. When I stepped onto the porch, Mrs. Evelyn beamed and greeted me like a daughter returning from a long journey. "Gloria, darling, you made it," I smiled. "Thank you for inviting me." "Oh, nonsense," she said, waving her hand. "It wouldn't be the same without you." A few neighbors looked up and offered warm greetings. Some had known me from years ago, small nods of recognition and genuine smiles. A couple of them mentioned how lovely it was to see new faces in the neighborhood, how they'd always loved this quiet street where folks stopped to say hello. I took a seat on a cushioned wicker chair, the kind that gave just enough support and just enough comfort. I accepted a cup of chamomile tea from Mrs. Evelyn and breathed in the calming aroma. Conversation danced lightly, weather, flowers, community events, no questions about my past life, no probing into personal wounds, just presence, just acceptance. Across from me sat a woman named Carol, who had recently retired from teaching art at the community center. She complimented my watercolor painting, mentioned she'd seen some of the works displayed on the bulletin board at the library. "You have a real gift," Carol said warmly. "Painting is just the language your heart has been waiting to speak." I felt myself blush. "Thank you," I said. "I'm learning." Beside her, A man named Roy spoke up. He kept bees, he told us, and had honey for sale if anyone wanted to try a jar. Bees are like people, he said with a grin. They thrive when they're doing what they were born to do. Laughter rippled around us. I watched Mrs. Evelyn move between guests with the grace of someone deeply anchored in kindness. I realized I'd been clinging to silence for so long that I'd almost forgotten how good it felt to be seen without judgment. At one point, Mrs. Evelyn leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm so glad you came." I looked around the porch, at faces lined with age and laughter and sun, and felt something I hadn't expected. Warmth. Not the heat of the afternoon sun, but the warmth of community. The kind that doesn't ask you to explain yourself. It just welcomes you. When it was time to leave, I thanked everyone for their company. I stepped onto the sidewalk just as a breeze kicked up, carrying the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. Walking home, I felt lighter, more myself than I had in weeks. I realized that I didn't need a big gathering or dramatic gesture to know I belonged somewhere. I just needed moments like these. Quiet, gentle, real. Back at the bungalow, I sat on my front steps with a cup of chamomile and watched the day soften into evening. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I wasn't sure where the letter had come from at first. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope, neatly addressed in a handwriting that looked familiar but out of place among the stack of bills and postcards. The return address was from a small town 40 miles north of Marietta, somewhere I hadn't been in years. I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time before I opened it. The script was neat, looping like someone took care with every stroke. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. Dear Miss Washington, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is Claire Matthews, you may remember me. I was in your 7th grade English class at Harmony Middle School back in 1998. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. You helped me through a difficult time when my father passed away, and you encouraged me to pursue writing. I never forgot your kindness. We are having a small reunion of former students and teachers next Saturday in Woodstock. I would be honored if you could join us. Many of us would love to see you again. Warm regards, Claire Matthews. My heart skipped a beat, not from shock, but from something warmer, softer. Recognition, belonging. I stood still for a moment, leaning against the counter. 7th grade. That was almost 30 years ago. So many faces, so many stories I'd tucked away in the quiet corners of my heart. For a long while, I wasn't sure how to respond. I paced the kitchen floor with the letter in my hand, then stepped out onto the small porch where morning light touched everything with gold. The breeze was mild, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on me. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe it was time. I pulled out my phone and typed a simple reply. Dear Claire, thank you for your kind words. I would be honored to attend the reunion. Sincerely, Gloria Washington. I hit send and exhaled. For days after, a flutter of anticipation followed me, an unfamiliar but welcome feeling. I found myself humming while I painted, organizing my brushes with a little extra care, and choosing an outfit for the reunion that felt both comfortable and special. Saturday arrived with clear skies, the kind of morning that makes you want to say thank you just for being alive. I drove to Woodstock, the hum of the engine steady beneath me. The town was small and charming, dotted with brick storefronts and shade trees that whispered in the breeze. I parked near the community hall where the reunion was being held and took a deep breath. Inside, the room was already filling with laughter, familiar faces, gray hair where once there had been curls and bright smiles. Some people recognized me immediately. Others needed a moment to place the face. Miss Washington. Oh my goodness! We wouldn't be here without you. The greetings were warm, full of genuine joy. No awkwardness, no judgments. Just appreciation. Claire Matthews found me first. She was taller now, with soft eyes and a voice that reached me before her words did. You came, she said, and hugged me like I was something precious she'd been holding on to through the years. I'm glad I did, I said. As I walked through the room, former students greeted me with stories, small but meaningful slices of their lives. One shared how writing poetry helped her through her divorce. Another said she became a teacher because of the way I believed in her words. I listened, laughing and nodding, but most of all I felt seen, not as someone's mistake or someone who had been discarded, but as someone who mattered, someone whose life had rippled outward in ways I never fully understood. There were photos from back then pinned up on a board, dated snapshots of class projects, field trips, school plays. There I was, younger, in a paisley dress, chalk dust on my fingers. Claire handed me a cup of punch and squeezed my shoulder. "You've been missed," she said simply. We gathered for a group photo, teachers and students, old friends who'd walked through time without losing connection. The click of the camera echoed in a way that felt timeless, like a moment worth remembering. Later, as the event wound down and folks began to say their goodbyes, I noticed an elderly couple lingering near the door. "I remember your watercolor painting," the woman said to me. "You always said colors can tell a story, words sometimes can't." I smiled. "I'm still learning that." Her husband nodded and offered a quiet compliment about the way I carried myself, with calm, with grace. In that moment, something lifted in me, a realization that my life was not defined by that house, or by a son who forgot his mother's worth, or by a chapter that ended in tears and trash bags. It was defined by moments like this, connections that transcended time, hearts that remembered. I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, breathing in the fresh breeze with nothing pressing against my chest. I had started this day holding a letter. I was leaving it holding memories. That night, I painted again, this time inspired by faces and names and laughter, colors intertwined on the paper like a quiet hymn of joy. This was new ground, and I was finally ready to walk on it. The call came early in the morning, just as the sun was hinting its first gold along the edge of my curtains. I was still wrapped in last night's throes, the kind that hold memory more than warmth, when the phone buzzed. "Sandra's office," I answered. My voice was slow, still marinating in sleep. "Gloria?" came Sandra's crisp voice on the other end. "I have news." I sat up. The quilt fell from my shoulders in a gentle rush, and for a moment I felt like I was waking not just from sleep, but from something long and indecisive. "Yes?" I said. "The property sold," she said. "Closed yesterday afternoon, and we secured more than your asking price." I blinked, startled not because I didn't expect it, but because the news landed with an odd sort of finality. It felt like the last page of a chapter I'd been rewriting in my mind for weeks. "That's wonderful," I said quietly. "It is," she agreed, "but there's a problem." I felt the breath leave me. "They, Troy and Brittany, are refusing to vacate." I was still processing her words when the next sentence pierced through quietly. "They're claiming tenant rights. They say they lived there long enough to acquire some legal protections under the local ordinances." I closed my eyes. I could see the house, the yellow door, the flower beds I'd never get to plant in. "They think they can stay," Sandra said, "unless we take action." The room felt suddenly too small. My heart thudded in a rhythmic way that felt like an alarm. "Let's talk to Robert," I said. I was in his office by late morning, the same office that had become a kind of neutral ground for so many revelations. Robert leaned back in his chair, listening with measured patience as I repeated the situation. "I don't want their suffering," I said, "but I didn't sell my home just to rent it to them." "It's not uncommon," Robert replied slowly. "Long-term occupancy can entitle someone to certain rights. But those rights don't equate to ownership. You've made your position clear. The sale is final." "But they refuse to leave," I whispered. "Do I really want to fight them in court?" Robert didn't look surprised. "This isn't personal. It's legal. You have every right to enforce the terms of sale. They do not own the property. They have no claim to it. If they refuse to vacate, the new owners will need to pursue eviction. Not a pleasant process, but the law is clear." His voice was calm, but I felt something stirring in me, a tenderness, a tension between justice and compassion. Afterward, I walked outside and let the sun touch my face. It was warm, but not unbearable. It felt like clarity. I wasn't angry at them. Not really. I was angry at the situation, at the betrayal, at the way life had demanded so much and given so little in return. But Robert was right. This wasn't about revenge. This was about rightful terms. I paced slowly down the walkway outside his office, then walked home with measured steps. I needed time to think, not as someone thrust into conflict, but as someone who had already chosen dignity over despair. That evening, I lit a candle in the living room. The desks and walls were starting to feel like home now, even if the memories attached to them were still forming. I poured myself a glass of iced tea, something sweet and cool, and sat on the couch, staring out the window at the sky turning amber. I thought about Troy and Brittany. I thought about the words George had written in that letter. Don't let them take your dignity. I hadn't forgotten. I just needed to understand what dignity looked like in this moment. It wasn't just about winning. It was about choosing who I was in the face of adversity. I stayed up late into the night, sipping tea and thinking. When the stars came out, they didn't ask anything of me. They just shone. Maybe that was the lesson. The next morning, I called Sandra and told her to proceed with the necessary notices. A cordial but firm communication. No threats. Just clarity. Just terms. Just justice. And when afternoon came, I walked out onto my porch, the breeze playing with the edges of my scarf. The house with the yellow door sat quietly across the street like a friend who had been with me on a long journey. I closed my eyes. This wasn't the home I raised my son in. It wasn't the house I sold. It was the place where I learned something invaluable. Home is where you rebuild yourself, not where you are remembered, but where you choose to be remembered with peace. I breathed in deeply and let the wind answer back. The future stretched ahead, not uncertain, but unwritten. And that was the greatest gift of all. The week after Sandra filed the legal notice, the air around me shifted. Not violently, not suddenly, but like a slow leak from a tire. You don't notice it right away, until the car begins to lean and the road doesn't feel the same. People started looking at me differently. Not my new neighbors, not Frank, not the kind souls from the reunion, but a few from the old neighborhood. A couple of familiar names from church circles. The kinds of people who had once nodded warmly now offered tight-lipped smiles or turned away. Apparently, Troy had been talking. Stories about how I'd sold the house out from under him, how I'd betrayed my own family for money, how I'd thrown his belongings out like trash. And though none of it was true, the weight of perception was real. One morning, I went to the grocery store and ran into an old acquaintance, Brenda. We'd sung in the same choir for years. She barely said hello, just nodded and kept walking. That night, I cried not from guilt, but from the familiar ache of being misunderstood, of having your narrative stolen and twisted. I kept thinking, does the truth even matter if nobody hears it? Then, 2 days later, I received another letter. This one was in a crisp envelope with a printed label. I assumed it was another legal document until I opened it and found a folded card with a floral design and a handwritten note. Dear Miss Washington, we wanted to thank you for entrusting us with your home. We just moved in last weekend, and though there's still much to unpack, we already feel such peace here. I'm 6 months pregnant with our first child, and my husband, Thomas, has been fixing up the nursery in the back room. The one with the big window, it catches the sunrise perfectly. Every morning, we stand there and imagine our baby waking up with that kind of light. We know a house is just wood and brick, but what you left here feels like more than that. It feels like love. Thank you for giving us a place to begin. With gratitude, Sarah and Thomas R. I read the letter 3 times. Then I held it to my chest and wept, not from pain this time, but from something deeper, a release. They had no idea what I'd been through to get to this point, no knowledge of the history behind those walls, or the betrayal, or the heartbreak, and still they'd felt something good, something holy. That meant I hadn't failed, not in the ways that mattered. That night, I sat at my writing desk, the one Frank had helped me repaint a soft sage green, and pulled out a sheet of good stationery, the kind I used to save for church correspondence or condolences. I didn't plan to write Troy, but my hand moved anyway. Dear Troy, this is not an attempt to change your mind. It is not a plea or a lecture. It's just a letter, one that I need to write not for you, but for me. You are my son. You always will be. I loved you before you were born. I prayed for you when you were still only a thought, and I have never stopped wanting good for you. But love is not the same as silence. Love is not agreeing with disrespect. Love does not mean sacrificing one's dignity to avoid discomfort. You say I sold your home, but that home was never taken from you. It was given. I gave it, again and again, in meals, in warmth, in shelter, in forgiveness. And when it became clear that you no longer saw me as a part of that home, I gave it a final time. I let it go. You may tell others your story. I cannot stop that. But I know mine, and I stand by it. If someday you remember the woman who raised you, not the version twisted by anger or pride, but the woman who held your fevered body, who taught you to read, who sat in parking lots waiting while you chased every dream. If you remember her, you'll know she did what she had to do. I wish you peace, Troy. Not out of spite, out of love. I didn't expect a response. I didn't even send it right away. I placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and left it on my desk for a day, then another. By the third day, I walked it to the mailbox and let it go. Sometimes, closure isn't mutual. Sometimes, it's the door you gently close, so the draft stops haunting your bones. That evening, Frank came by with lemon bars wrapped in foil. "Thought you might need something sweet," he said. I poured us tea, and we sat on the porch under the soft blue of twilight. I didn't tell him about the letter. I didn't need to. He knew, just from the way I exhaled. "You look lighter," he said. "I think I finally put something down I wasn't meant to carry anymore," I said. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. And for the first time in months, I felt completely at ease. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. It was Nora, our watercolor instructor, who first mentioned the exhibit. She stood in front of the class one Thursday morning, clapping her paint-stained hands with excitement. "We've been invited to submit works to the Midtown Arts Collective's Spring Show. It's a community event open to all ages and experience levels. Nothing formal, just a celebration of local art." A few murmurs of interest rippled around the room, but my brush froze mid-stroke. "Exhibit? My art? In public?" I smiled politely and lowered my gaze, focusing on the soft lavender I was brushing into the petals of a wildflower. Nora walked past my seat and tapped the corner of my canvas. "Don't even think about not submitting," she whispered. "That piece is pure story." I glanced at the painting, a quiet house beneath a pale yellow sky, a single chair on the porch, the suggestion of warmth behind the front window. I hadn't even realized I'd painted it until I stood back and saw it there. My old home. Not exactly, but emotionally. The way it had once made me feel. Later that day, Frank caught up with me in the parking lot. "You gonna do the exhibit?" he asked, handing me a cup of coffee like always. "I'm not sure," I said. "That's for real artists. I just play with color." "You tell stories," he said, "and you tell them in a way that makes people feel something. That's art, Gloria." I didn't reply, but something in his tone stayed with me. That evening, I looked again at my painting, the yellow house, the lone chair, the faint blush of dawn in the sky. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I wrapped it in brown paper, wrote my name on the back, and dropped it off at the community center the next morning. The exhibition took place in an old converted firehouse, all exposed brick and wooden beams, strings of lights crossing the ceiling like constellations. There were tables with pottery, rows of photographs, and canvas after canvas of color and feeling. People mingled with wine glasses in hand, pointing, admiring, smiling. I kept close to the edge of the room, heart fluttering like a loose shutter in a storm. Frank arrived 20 minutes later, dressed in his best flannel and grinning. "Your painting's in the front room," he said. They gave it a spotlight. I followed him through the crowd, each step feeling like it might be a mistake. And there it was. Mounted on a soft gray wall, my painting looked more alive than I remembered. The yellows glowed under the gallery lights. The window shimmered with suggestion. Beneath it, a small card read, "Morning Memory by Gloria Washington." People paused in front of it, tilted their heads, whispered things I couldn't hear, but no one laughed. No one dismissed it. A woman with silver hair and a navy scarf stepped up beside me. "Is this yours?" she asked gently. I nodded, too stunned to speak. "It reminds me of my grandmother's house," she said. "It feels like warmth, and maybe a little sadness, but not the heavy kind, the kind that means something mattered." I felt my throat tighten. "Thank you," I said quietly. She smiled and moved on. I stood there a while longer, watching strangers interact with a piece of my heart made visible. There was a strange power in it, not pride, exactly, more like peace, like I'd translated a wound into something soft and shareable. Later, as I made my way back toward the entrance, Frank caught my arm. "Someone left this for you," he said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a folded note and a check. "Miss Washington." I saw your painting and felt a pull I haven't felt in years. My wife and I lost our home in a fire last year. Seeing your work, it reminded me that warmth isn't a building, it's what we carry. I'd be honored to hang this in our new home. With gratitude, H. Lewis. I stared at the check. It wasn't a large amount, but it was enough to say, this meant something to someone. Frank watched me read it. You okay? He asked. I nodded slowly. Better than okay. He smiled. Told you, you're an artist. I laughed, soft and free. I guess I am. We stepped outside, the spring air warm and kind. Across the street, children played under the blossoming dogwood trees. I thought about how far I'd come, from the sidewalk outside my old home, to this moment. A woman who was once discarded, now cherished. Not because of what she gave, but because of who she is. I took Frank's arm and we walked toward the car. My painting sold, my story seen, and I wasn't done yet. I would keep painting. Not for praise, not for validation, but because finally I had something to say, and I was ready to say it with color, with courage, with every brushstroke of truth. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting warm ribbons of gold across the hardwood floors of my little bungalow. The house felt calm, settled into its own rhythm, like the beginnings of a favorite song. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, poured a cup, and carried it out to the small table on the porch. The steam rose in lazy spirals as birdsong danced between distant sounds of tires on pavement and early commuters. This had become my ritual. A quiet start, a moment of peace before the world pulled me into its currents. The letter from the couple, Sarah and Thomas, was still tucked into the front pocket of my watercolor journal. I touched it gently with the tip of my finger and smiled. A reminder that even the simplest acts of giving could ripple into something meaningful. I took a sip of coffee and watched the day breathe itself awake. Later in the morning, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I wasn't expecting company, especially not someone younger. She stood there holding a small sketch pad, her eyes wide and earnest. Miss Washington? She asked, her voice gentle but full of certainty. I'm Ava. I saw your painting at the exhibit last weekend. I wanted to thank you. I invited her in with a welcoming smile. She stepped onto the porch and sat across from me, clutching her sketch pad as if it were a treasure chest. Your piece, morning memory, she said, breathing the words like they held a sacred quality. It made me think about home differently, about beginnings and loss, and how those things shape us. I nodded slowly, feeling the familiar warmth of connection, unexpected, healing, quiet. I didn't realize art could do that, I said. It does, she said, at least when it's real. She opened her sketch pad and showed me several drawings, half-formed landscapes, a splash of color hinting at something wild behind the scenes. Each had energy, each had honesty. I want to be an artist, she said, eyes bright. But my family, they want me to study business. They say art won't pay the bills. I understood that very well. I reached for my coffee again, trying to find the right words through the summer warmth in my chest. You know, I said, when I was younger, I never thought I'd pick up a brush again. Life just took over. Responsibilities, work, my son. But maybe those things don't have to steal our dreams. Maybe they just delay them. She looked at me, curiosity shining. I didn't start painting until recently, I continued. And I never expected my work to matter to anyone, but here you are telling me it does. That's something powerful. She smiled shyly. Do you think I could ever be good? I mean, really be good? I leaned back and looked at her sketches again. I think you already are, I said. But good isn't about perfection. Good is about truth, the way your art makes someone feel understood. That's what matters. Ava's smile widened. We spent the next hour talking about color and form and the stories that lived behind brushstrokes. She shared her dreams of painting landscapes, big, sweeping fields of light and shadow. I shared my own thoughts about how art can be a mirror we hold up to our own souls. Eventually, she stood to leave, clutching her sketch pad with newfound confidence. Thank you, she said softly. I really needed that. You're welcome anytime, I replied. Later that afternoon, I pulled out my watercolors again and set up at the kitchen table. The morning had left a gentle glow in my heart, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't second-guess what I painted. I dipped the brush into the water, then into a soft wash of cerulean blue. I thought of the sky over Woodstock, the laughter of old friends, the unexpected kindness of strangers, and I began. The colors flowed, some bold, some hesitant, all honest. I painted an open field, tall grasses waving in the breeze. A path wound through it. The horizon glowed with dawn light, full of promise. I didn't try to make it perfect. I tried to make it true. And when I finally set the brush down, I stepped back and studied what had emerged on the page. Something bright and unafraid. Something like hope. I placed it beside the other pieces on the wall, the sunrise house, the lemons on a table, the quiet park bench where Frank and I had sat. They weren't just paintings. They were markers, breadcrumbs on the path of who I had become. Later that evening, I walked to the mailbox and found a postcard tucked inside. It was from Claire, the former student who had invited me to the reunion. "Thinking of you, Gloria," it read. "Consider submitting another piece next year. The world needs more color from your heart." I smiled, sliding the card into my journal. Maybe I would. Maybe I would keep painting not because it defined me, but because it reminded me that life can be shaped with gentle strokes, brave, bright, and unashamed. I walked back to my bungalow, the porch light glowing softly through the twilight. Art wasn't just something I did. It was something I lived. And for the first time in a very long while, my heart felt full. The day began with a sky the color of pale blue glass, and I felt it in my bones before I even stepped out the door. There was a certain clarity in the air, like the world had exhaled overnight and was finally ready for something gentle. Frank pulled up in his Buick right on time, the early sun glinting off the windshield. He wore his favorite denim jacket, the one with the soft shoulders and familiar creases that spoke of comfort rather than style. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm in that easy way it always was. "Good morning," I replied, stepping into the passenger seat. I had packed a small tote with watercolors, paper, and a light lunch peach slices, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "I figured we could take our painting out to the park," he said. "Sunlight does funny things on shadows and texture." I smiled at that. He was right. I felt lighter today, not just in spirit, but in purpose. We drove to Lakeview Park, a wide expanse of green that curved around a glittering little lake. Ducks drifted in lazy circles, their soft quacks floating on the breeze. The grass was damp with morning dew, and the air smelled like newly cut hay and wildflowers. We found a spot beneath an old oak tree, its branches wide like arms ready to hold secrets. As I spread out the paper and paints, Frank settled beside me with his camera and a thermos of iced tea. He propped the camera on his knee and peered through the lens before lowering it to look at me. "You know," he said, "when I started photography decades ago, it was all about capturing what was there. Now, it's about capturing what's felt." I looked at him, studying the lines around his eyes, sudden cracks of wisdom that time had etched gently, like fine trace paths leading back to stories waiting to be told. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," he said, tilting his head toward the lake, "that some moments are more than just visual. They're emotional echoes. Like this day. You can see the light, but you can't capture the warmth in a single snapshot." I dipped my brush into a soft wash of green and began to let it bleed across the paper. Frank watched me with kindness, not the kind that watches to judge, but the kind that watches to understand. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore and distant laughter from families setting up picnics. Finally, he broke the quiet. "You've changed," he said. "In the best way." I paused, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "When I first met you, you carried the world in your chest like it was a suitcase tied shut. But now, you're unpacking. Not hurriedly, not out of desperation, but with acceptance." I touched my brush to the paper again, a gentle stroke of sunrise yellow. "Maybe I'm just learning what belongs to me," I said. He smiled, and for a moment something passed between us that wasn't spoken but understood. "So," he said, switching topics, "there's something I want to show you." He lifted his camera, unplugged something from inside his bag, and revealed a small folder of prints, his photographs. "Upcoming exhibit," he explained. "They asked me to submit work for a gallery downtown. I'm nervous." I thumbed through the photos. Black and white shots of city streets, children playing in fountains, an old man feeding birds at dawn, a couple walking hand in hand under umbrellas. Then I stopped. One image pulled me in a portrait of an elderly woman sitting alone on a porch with a distant look in her eyes, bathed in afternoon light. The emotion was palpable. "That's beautiful," I whispered. "Thank you," he said, watching me closely. "But this one's my favorite." He flipped to a photo of a quiet path through a meadow, sunlight tipping the tops of grasses like scattered gold. "It reminds me of you," he said. I felt a warmth rush through me, not the kind that speaks of romance, but the kind that speaks of understanding, appreciation, and companionship. We talked about his exhibit, the stories behind the shots, the inspiration that moved him, and all the while I painted small impressions of the park, a sketch here, a splash of color there. At one point, he paused and looked at me with something like wonder. "You know," he said, "I think art has made you braver." "Bravery isn't loud," I replied. "Sometimes it's just being willing to stay in the light a little longer." He nodded, considering that. We packed up as the sun dipped lower, casting shadows that felt soft and long, the kind that make a day feel lived instead of rushed. On the drive home, we didn't talk much. Just the quiet hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of wheels on the road, and something unspoken settling into ease between us. When he pulled up to my bungalow, I turned to him with a small smile. "Thank you," I said, "not just for today, but for the kindness of seeing me." He nodded, understanding more than words could convey. I stepped out onto my porch, closing the screen door gently behind me. The breeze brushed against the porch light, and I felt a quiet contentment bloom at the center of my chest. This wasn't about love in the dramatic sense. This was about connection, about being witnessed, about being understood without needing explanation. And it was beautiful. I watched him drive away, the sunset tucked behind his car like a story trailing into color and shadow. Inside, I set down the watercolor kit and glanced at the small drawings pinned above the kitchen table, little testaments of growth, of mornings lived and reclaimed. I poured a glass of iced tea and sat in the quiet that felt soft and not lonely. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and right now, that was enough. The morning sun slipped through the curtains and landed on the painting I had made of the oak tree in Lakeview Park, light dappled across its branches like a promise. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen, holding a cup of tea, and watched the warm glow settle into the room. My phone buzzed. It was a message from the Community Arts Center. "Would you be interested in teaching a watercolor workshop next month?" They were looking for someone with experience and heart. My heart skipped, not from shock, but from the weight of possibility. Teaching, not just painting for myself, but guiding others. I stared at the message for several moments, unsure of what it would mean to step into that role not as a student, but as a teacher again. And then I heard a soft knock at the front door. My breath slowed. It was early. No visitors expected. I opened the door, and there he stood. Troy. His face looked older, not just from age but from tension, as if life had weighted him down in places I had never noticed before. "Mom," he said quietly. I didn't invite him in immediately. Instead, I stood in the doorway, hands folded gently. "Troy," I said, "what brings you here?" He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up, his eyes uncertain. I heard you were selling the house," he began. "Saw the announcement, and I wanted to talk." The air between us was thick, thin in words, but heavy with history. "Come sit," I said after a moment, stepping back and gesturing toward the porch swing. He sat. I remained standing. What were the words for a meeting like this? What had been bottled up for years that needed release? Moments passed before he spoke again. I'm sorry," he said, "for the way I treated you, for everything." I didn't move. His eyes were raw, honest in a way I hadn't expected. "I always thought I was doing what was best," he continued, "but I see now. I was wrong." I took a slow breath. Years of hurt and misunderstanding hung in the air between us, like fragile glass waiting to be touched. "Troy," I said gently, "I never stopped loving you, but love doesn't mean overlooking disrespect." He looked down, breathing hard. "You were always there for me," he said, "and I never stopped to think of you as a person with your own dreams. I only saw my own." The silence was quiet, but it wasn't heavy. It was honest. I stepped around the porch swing and took the seat beside him. "I forgive you," I said, not because what happened was easy, but because holding on to pain would only hurt us both more. He closed his eyes. "I don't expect everything to be okay overnight," I continued, "but I want you to grow not just as a father someday, but as a human being." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, I saw a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of understanding, of awakening. When he stood to leave, he paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then he walked away. I watched until he turned the corner. Later that afternoon, I sat with my watercolor journal and thought about the morning's encounter. It had been difficult, tender, and I didn't expect closure to feel so gentle. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, seldom came in thunderous moments. It came in quiet understanding. Later that evening, the mailbox yielded a small envelope. I opened it and found a letter from the Arts Center, the formal invitation to teach the workshop. They described the group of older adults eager to explore watercolor and learn from someone whose work spoke of resilience and heart. I read it twice. Teaching. This felt like a new beginning, not a return to old roles, but a transformation of them. I took my brush and dipped it in a shade of warm orange, something bright, something that spoke of sunrise and second chances. On the paper, I sketched a simple horizon line. In the gentle spread of pigments, I found peace. And as the sunset turned the sky to honey and rose, I realized that forgiveness like art was not about erasing what came before. It was about choosing how to use color in the moments ahead. The room smelled of paint and paper. A dozen easels stood in a wide semicircle, each one manned by someone with gray at their temples or arthritis in their knuckles, but none of that mattered today. What mattered was the look in their eyes, the quiet excitement, the nervous hope. I stood at the front of the community art room with my watercolor set laid out before me, my palms warm but not sweaty, my voice steady but humble. "Welcome," I said with a smile, "to this next chapter of your story." A few of them smiled back. One woman in a lavender sweater reached for her brush like it was a familiar friend. A man in a corduroy jacket cleared his throat and nodded, silently signaling that he was ready. I began with the basics, wet-on-wet techniques, color mixing, soft blending, but quickly pivoted to something deeper. "Don't just paint what you see," I said gently. "Paint what you feel. Think of a moment that shaped you, a memory that never quite left. Start from there." There was a stillness in the room after I said it then, like a tide slowly returning, the room filled with the rustle of brushes moving. I wandered among them, offering guidance, encouragement. One woman painted a church pew, another the back porch of her childhood home. A man painted a pair of hands calloused, working, strong. Every canvas told a life. And I realized, right then, that this class wasn't about technique. It was about voice, about reclaiming what had been buried beneath obligation, silence, or fear, just as I had. At the end of the session, as students packed up, one elderly man lingered behind. He wore a green cap, eyes tired but kind. He tapped his painting lightly. "It's not good," he muttered. I looked at it, an abstract swirl of blue and gold, layered and stormy. "It's honest," I said. He smiled. "First time I've painted since my wife died. She always said I should." My throat tightened. "She'd be proud," I said. When everyone had gone, I stood alone in the empty room, the smell of turpentine and dreams still in the air. I took a deep breath. This, I realized, was justice. Not courtroom drama, not revenge, but standing in the center of your truth without apology. Being seen. Not because you demanded it, but because you finally allowed yourself to shine. Later that week, I went to visit Ava. We painted in her tiny apartment, sipping tea and laughing as we critiqued each other's creative choices. She showed me a series she'd started, bold, emotional portraits of women in motion. "They're not finished," she said shyly. "Neither are we," I said with a wink. Before I left, she hugged me tightly. "You helped me find myself," she whispered. I smiled and said, "You were never lost, just waiting." One evening, I sat on my porch with Frank. The sky was painted in strokes of pink and tangerine. He turned to me and said, "If you could go back to the day you stood in front of your house, groceries in hand, what would you say to yourself?" I thought for a long time, then replied softly, "I'd say, hold on, this isn't the end. It's the beginning of something better." He nodded. That's a good answer. I looked at him. No, that's the truth. We sat in silence as the stars began to blink awake. And now, as I write this alone, but not lonely, I think about how far I've come. I remember the moment I was thrown away like trash. I remember the sting of betrayal, the weight of silence, the heartbreak. But I also remember the day I sold the house and bought my freedom. The day I picked up a paintbrush and found my voice. The day I forgave my son not because he earned it, but because I needed to let go. Justice did come, not loud, not public, but in small, sacred victories. In laughter shared with strangers. In memories painted in color. In the gentle hush of a classroom where stories take form through brushstrokes. And in my own heart, whole, strong, awake. Because justice isn't always a gavel or a courtroom. Sometimes, justice is a woman on her porch, sipping tea in the twilight, knowing she's finally come home to herself. This story is a quiet reminder that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. It often comes in silence, in healing, and in reclaiming one's dignity. Gloria's journey teaches us that even after betrayal, after being discarded by those we love most, we still hold the power to rebuild. Not by seeking revenge, but by rediscovering our voice, our value, and our place in the world. For anyone who's ever been made to feel invisible, this is a story of resilience, of rising, and of knowing deep down that you are never too old to begin again.